head. She is wearing her Seattle Sports Commission hat today. So lovely to be with you, and there was wonderful energy in the room, and I'm sure that there's a wonderful group on Zoom, so we're grateful to have your time this afternoon. As we convene, we respectfully acknowledge that we do so on unceded Coast Salish land, specifically the ancestral land of the Duwamish, Suquamish, Stillaguamish, and Muckleshoot tribes. We acknowledge and pay respect to the First Peoples who gathered here, to elders past and present, and to all Indigenous people. I attended my first play in 3 years at the Seattle Rep this last weekend, and it was a lovely one-woman show of a young woman who is a Mohican tribe theater playwright and actress, and was storytelling. Did you see it too? It was gorgeous. I was a little worried that I only got snippets because there was so much densely packed in there. And in her note in the playbill, she said, "My hope is that you just get a couple snippets of stories and that you remember to ask others their story." So may we enter the day with that curiosity that makes us richer. And may we start our time together with music and inspiration. We're going to have Trish Bostrom and Marley Iverson help us with our opening song, and then we've got Kathy Gibson with inspiration. Come on up.
So when Marley and I play piano, we always start with this song because it's so happy, it's so joyful. And we've got great Sue Nixon to stand up here and join us. So we're going to sing Blue Moon. Here we go. Watch me, because we might speed up or slow down. Here we go, Sue. Blue moon, you want me standing alone, without a dream in my heart, without a love of my own. You sound good. Here we go. Blue moon, you knew just what I was there for. You heard me saying a prayer for someone I really could care for. And then you suddenly appeared before me, the only one my arms could ever hold. Then somebody said, "Please adore me." And when I looked, the moon would turn to gold. Well done. Ooh, moon, now I'm no longer alone, without a dream in my heart, without a love of my own. You were great.
Please be seated. Well, today we welcome President Penalver to Seattle Rotary. As the new leader at Seattle University, he sets the tone for students, faculty, staff, and is the face of Seattle University in our community. His visit today prompted me to reflect on what others have had to say about higher education. So I'm going to share some of those thoughts with you. The privilege of a university education is a great one. The more widely it is extended, the better for any country. So said Winston Churchill. The purpose of education is to replace an empty mind with an open one. So said Malcolm Forbes. The aim of university education should be to turn out true servants of the people who will live and die for that country's freedom. So said Mahatma Gandhi. Knowledge is recognizing that you know and what you don't know. Anybody know who said that? Confucius. Education is the ability to listen to almost anything without losing your temper or your self-confidence. So said Robert Frost. And from Richard Branson, who actually didn't have a chance to pursue a higher education, he said, "I see life almost like one long university education session that I never had. Every day I'm learning something new." So what I love about Rotary and Rotarians is that we are all lifelong learners. Like every Wednesday, I know I'll leave today's meeting and I will have at least one opportunity this afternoon to say to someone, "Do you know what I learned at Rotary today?"
I love that. Tricia, Marley, thank you so much for opening us in song, and Kathy, both for your inspiration and for being with John Hajiboom, welcoming us into the meeting today. Eric Corning, thank you for serving as our Zoom meeting host and all who are attending on Zoom. And Paul Casey for capturing our meeting report, which will show up in the Totem, our Friday newsletter when it comes out. We have several guests joining us today, so I'm going to read your names. Please stand as I do, and let's hold our applause until everybody's standing, and then we can welcome them all together. We've got Abra Sittler, Jatine and Shruti Atre, Amit Shukla of Seattle University, guest of Joe Phillips. Sarah Cox as well is a guest of Joe Phillips. Jacob Wood, a guest of David Woodward. Nathan Bello and Stevie Rotella. Oh, but Nathan's also a guest of David. And then Stevie Rotella, guest of Mark Wright. And I just got to meet Asunta's son, Jason. So let's have him stand too. Wonderful to have you here. Thank you. As many of you know, my father was a member of Rotary in our hometown for 65 years. And I got to see him and his Rotary colleagues build the high school sports stadium, do annual fundraisers. I was usually put to work. What it taught me is the powerful connection that Rotarians have with their community and the richness of that. And so it is our honor to have John Scholes here with the Downtown Seattle Association to talk to us a bit about update with plans and programs and how we can continue that connection and partnership. Welcome, John.
Thank you so much, and you all have been so gracious to give me a few moments every now and then to give you an update on the progress toward recovery and reimagining downtown Seattle as we've worked our way out of this pandemic. And I'm really looking forward to hearing from Eduardo, and was glad to see him on the bill today. Eduardo is a new member of the board of the Downtown Seattle Association as of July, so we're grateful to have his service. And I think he probably could have given this, and I could just yield my 2 minutes to him, but we look forward to hearing from him. I'm here with a couple of just data points and charts and graphs. So if you like numbers and charts and graphs, you'll love this. If you don't, bear with me. But I did want to take the opportunity just to report in on sort of where we've been over the last several months in downtown. We track a bunch of metrics on a weekly and monthly basis. We're putting out a recovery dashboard once a month, and we've got some things that trend well here. Here we're looking at the number of visitors to downtown going back to 2019, and you can see on the right-hand side of that chart, in August, we were right back to generally what we'd expect in the summer of 2019, more than 3 million people coming downtown. So that doesn't include people who live or work downtown. That's people coming for other reasons, like going to the Rep and other great events downtown. So really positive news there. Next slide. Return to work, it's been a little slower, but we're going in the right direction. We had the highest number of folks in their offices in the month of August than what we've seen since the start of the pandemic. We're just behind Portland here, ahead of some of our other peers on the West Coast, and generally kind of hitting the national average of 44% relative to the same week or month in 2019 of us spending 3 or more days a week in the office. So if you track all of that, that's what that 44% signals. So if you're here a day or two a week, you're not captured in that number. It's really looking at 3 or more. And I think within the next 6 months, a year, don't pin me down to it, I think we're going to see a majority of people back in the office a majority of the week. When you look at the surveys of both employees of employers, that's generally where things are trending. Doesn't mean we're going to be back 5 days a week, and I think there is going to be certainly some impact to the office sector in not just this downtown, but downtowns across the country. But I think the office and downtowns in general are still very relevant to work, particularly in-person connection and collaboration like this. Next slide. The story of the return of residents to downtown has been another great one through the pandemic. You know, we were having an incredible run of 20 years, lots of people moving downtown, families, singles, couples, seniors, and we, for the first time in more than 2 decades, saw more people leave downtown than moved in the first part of 2020. But since then, and really started in the midpoint of 21, we've seen them plus others return today, more people living in downtown Seattle than ever before, 100,000 people when you look at downtown from Seattle Center, South Lake Union down to the stadiums and include First Hill. So really positive trends there, and it kind of makes sense, you know, when the city shut down and all those reasons that people like to be downtown weren't open and available, people went elsewhere. As things reopen, they return. Next slide. I'm trying to read it from here. What is that saying? Okay, I think this is, I'm gonna have to step over here. Yes. Not surprising, lots of visitors mean lots of room nights sold in our hotels. And in the month of August, we had the second highest hotel occupancy in the country of the top 25 urban markets. There were certain weekends and weeks throughout the summer we were number one. So the hotel demand and occupancy has been phenomenal. Oh, there it is, yeah, thank you. I'm gonna skip those takeaways, but just keeping on the hotel number. The return of visitors, I think, is a really great story, right? And it's been well balanced. It's been not just convention, but it's been convention, leisure travel, cruise, group business. And I think, to me, it tells us that our brand, nationally, internationally, remains really strong. I think all of us were worried. We took some hits there throughout the pandemic, bad headlines, negative storylines throughout the country and on news stations in other parts of the country that, you know, we don't want to see that. But it tells me that people want to be here. They want to come. They had a great experience before. They want to return. But we can take nothing for granted. I think the experience, particularly this experience out on the streets, is still got to be job number one, making it safe, healthy, welcoming for everybody. If we don't get that right, people will make other choices, whether it's for work, living, or visiting. And we want them to choose Seattle. And downtowns, to me, and I think you believe, or else you wouldn't have kind of given this opportunity over the last year and a half, are incredibly important to the health of our whole city, our whole region, the places we all come to connect, to share our similarities, but also celebrate our differences. And if I can ask you to do one thing, is to communicate with the Seattle City Council in their budget process that you believe the health of downtown is important and you support their investment in public safety and addressing the crisis of homelessness. We all can do that. Send one email, council@seattle.gov. You'll connect with all 9 of them. Appreciate the opportunity and your partnership and support of downtown. Thank you all.
Thank you, John. I am Ken Grant. Sue said I needed no introduction. So I'm going to, Prince of Programs, thank you. Thank you for that. So I'm going to pick up on where John just left off, which I can't physically see him anymore. That was weird. A magic trick. Oh, you couldn't be sitting any closer. When I first moved to Seattle in 1995, I didn't know a lot about the city. I knew there was grunge. I knew I'd have to buy at least a dozen flannel shirts. I knew of the market, the Space Needle, and our next guest today, who will be bringing us so many cool stories about the Smith Tower. My dear friend, Kelsey Hutchinson, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me today. All right, so I'm just going to get going here. These days, the Space Needle is really what represents Seattle. But prior to the World's Fair, the Smith Tower was the cat's meow and really the icon of the city. In 1914, when the Smith Tower was completed, it was the tallest building west of the Mississippi, and it remained the tallest building on the West Coast until 1962, when the Space Needle, sorry, I'm missing the slide here, when the Space Needle was built. Let's start from the very beginning. We'll talk a little bit about how Smith Tower came to be. So the image on the left, can I go to the next slide? There we go. The image on the left is Lyman Cornelius Smith. He's the Smith Tower's namesake. He was an industrialist from Syracuse, New York, and he made his fortune selling firearms and typewriters. And so you can see here in the middle is featured the Smith & Corona typewriter, as well as just an advertisement here for Smith Tower guns, or Smith guns. Okay, I found the right button this time. All right, L.C. Smith and his wife visited Seattle well after the Great Seattle Fire of 1889 and at the beginning of the Klondike Gold Rush, just when Seattle was really starting to grow as a city. His wife fell in love with the city and convinced him to purchase the land at Yesler and 2nd, and it would eventually become Smith Tower. He decided he wanted to make something grand, so his plans were for an 18-story building, but his son Burns was living in New York at the time and really watching all of the construction going on there and the skyscrapers that were being built, so he's like, Dad, you gotta make it grander. So then it became 25 stories, and then 30 stories, and finally they landed on 42 stories. And just to kind of talk about what the story actually means, so 10 feet is about what a story equates to, so in keeping in mind with that, the building has 38 physical floors from the ground up, so it equates to about 42 stories. One of the most fascinating things, I think, and significant things about Smith Tower is the architectural beauty. It is a unique part of Seattle's quirky history and is a part of what makes Seattle, Seattle. Construction began in 1911 and was a major undertaking. Smith enlisted the New York architectural firm Gagin & Gagin to design the tower, and they had previously never designed a tower larger than 5 stories. Kind of crazy to think about. A lot of trust there. Lyman died in 1910, so it was finished by his son Burns, but it opened to the public on July 4th, 1914. Burns used the opportunity to advertise to guests outside by giving postcards to guests that were visiting that day so they could send to their friends and family to, have them come back to Seattle and to Smith Tower. More than 1,500 people visited that day, and they only paid 25 cents to visit, which is crazy to think about with now inflation. And the Smiths didn't spare any expense when they were building the tower, so there's about 2,300 windows that are encased in bronze frames, 1,400 doors, 40 feet of molding, and most of the glass that's in the building still is the original 1914 glass. The building was made of Pittsburgh steel, and it's reinforced with 2 inches of concrete as well. The office doors in the building are steel, but they're painted to look like mahogany wood. So just a lot of attention to detail when the building was built. Originally, there were 540 offices, 6 retail stores, 2 telegraph offices, and a public telephone station in the building. And at the very top of the tower, the triangular peak, there was a 10,000-gallon water tank that was concealed in the pyramid right above the observatory floor. And the pyramid had 3 tiers of windows, but there were no actual floors within the pyramid portion. Later, the tank was taken down piece by piece, and then it was converted, as everyone probably knows, into a private residence known as the Penthouse today. Ornate decor from foreign places was a way to showcase wealth and status. This was certainly the case on the 35th floor of Smith Tower. The Chinese room it was called was rumored to have been furnished by Cixi, the Empress of China, as a gift to Elsie Smith. It features a carved teak wood ceiling with inlaid porcelain and 17th century works of Chinese art, ornate antique black furniture, and a wishing chair that there's rumored to have a legend to be a catalyst for marriage for any unmarried woman that sat in the chair. Most of this is legend, but it's fun folklore, I think. The 2 images here show the beauty in colorful porcelain tiles and hand-carved teak wood on the ceiling on the 35th floor, which can still be seen today, and 100% one of my favorite things there. Here pictured on the left is the wishing chair, still on the 35th floor, which is now called the observatory. And the top right showcases the first 2 floors made of granite and the copper door entry to the building. The bottom image is showing the terracotta, which the building is made out of, and it's actually a very interesting self-cleaning material. So the building's been professionally cleaned once in the building's history in 1976. It's crazy to think about in a city that rains as much as it does that it looks so good after 108 years. So as we move into the interior of the building, we see the continuation of the architectural beauty. Pictured in the top right are the penny tiles. There's thousands of hand-laid tiles within the building that you'll see that most of them remain today, but they have numbers on them. When elevator operators were driving the elevators, that's how they knew where they were going and which floor to stop at. Before you had buttons, you called up and down the elevator shaft in order to get a ride. So pictured in the bottom right is the copper panel that's in the building in the lobby. It just kind of shows which elevator service which part of the building. And all of the elevators are original to the building and were manually operated up until 2017, the last of which was Car 7, the only one that supports the observatory, was modernized in 2018, making the ride from 90 seconds to 30 seconds, so pretty quick ride up. And these were believed to be the last bank of manually operated elevators on the West Coast. Pictured on the bottom left and top left in the middle are the Smith Tower Express elevator, which is Car 7. And the interior of the cab is original, so it is the original copper cage. It used to be just an open bird style cage, and then kind of in the 1970s, just due to people's vertigo and kind of uncomfortability of being able to see all the way around, they did put some brass on the inside to make people feel a little more comfortable riding inside. But the wheel you see there and the throttle is how they used to drive the elevator, lifting the cab up and down, and the wheels were used to level out between the floors. Since Elsie Smith died before the construction, his son, to commemorate him, literally put his initials everywhere you could see in the building. So on doorknobs, on the elevator panels, which is just really cool to see how he commemorated his father. The photo on the top left here shows a portion of the historical exhibit today on the first floor and postcards that are given as admission tickets to keep up that 108-year-old tradition of giving postcards to guests that visit. This postcard actually features the original DC Otis elevator, which is actually part of the exhibits today that you can see. And the image on the top right and bottom left. There you can see the beautiful building structure in the lobby, and on the way up to the second floor is onyx mined from the Pedrara quarry in Mexico, and it's often mistaken for marble. Really magnificent to see. The image on the bottom right displays Alaskan marble wainscoting, and you'll see that when you're riding up in the elevator on most of the floors, even to this day. All right, so Smith Tower is famous for being the first skyscraper in Seattle and for its architectural beauty, but there's also some fun, unique ties to the city. We're gonna highlight a few here. So pictured in the middle there is Roy and Elise Olmsted. Roy was the king of the Puget Sound bootleggers in the 1920s. Olmsted became involved with illegal alcohol distribution while he was a lieutenant with the Seattle Police Department. And later he needed to find legitimate business ventures, so he met an engineer and radio shop owner named Alfred Hubbard. Together they founded the local radio station, KFQX, in the spare bedroom of the Olmsted home. Elise ran the station and read nightly bedtime stories for children over the air as Aunt Vivian, which were broadcast from the secondary space or studio space they had at Smith Tower. Federal prohibition never proved, but believed that Aunt Vivian was using her radio show to send encrypted coded messages to her rum runner husband. He was eventually caught, but today Smith Tower keeps the tradition kind of going with the rum running roots, and they have a rum runner card program there today. The image on the bottom left is the submarine room, and in the 1960s, it was one of the first gay bars in Seattle and was in the Smith Tower's basement. The image on the top right and left are of Ivor Haglund, one of Smith Tower's famous owners who watched the building rise as a child, and he acquired it in the 1970s. In 1977, he flew a 16-foot salmon-shaped windsock, which the city wasn't too keen on, but anyhow. He's also known for the white bar, the cage that you see around the observatory deck today. He was the one that had that installed. On the bottom right, you can see the teardrop windows. For anyone who's a musician fan and follows local music here in Seattle, Ben Gibbard wrote a song called Teardrop Windows, and that is based on the Smith Tower's peaked windows there. King Broadcasting, I think everyone's probably familiar, now King was founded on the 21st floor of Smith Tower in 1947 and remained in the tower for 35 years as it expanded from radio to television. It's interesting to see the depiction and evolution of the Seattle skyline from Smith Tower as when it was the tallest building and now to where it is kind of dwarfed by all these other skyscrapers. In 2015, Utica Properties purchased the building and invested significant capital into renovating the 35th floor and ground floor to launch a new and improved visitor experience that would feature a speakeasy-inspired bar and historical exhibits to share with locals and visitors. The Smith Tower is also home to many different businesses and tenants. Today, you can sip cocktails and eat local Pacific Northwest Asian-inspired food, take in breathtaking views of Rainier, the Olympics, Elliott Bay, and downtown, and learn about the history of the building and significance in Seattle. The Observatory Bar specializes in craft cocktails such as old-fashioned variations, Manhattans, and a myriad of other classic cocktails. Thanks so much, everybody. And this is just a subtle hint. If you haven't been to Smith Tower, go check it out.
That was fascinating. I just rode the ferry back from Bainbridge Island and was struck by the Smith Tower, knowing this program was coming up. Even though it's small, it twinkles, and now I know why. What a spicy place that is. I'm going to go see it. John, thank you also for your update. I love the up and to the right trends. That's super encouraging. So a reminder, we're gonna transition into our main program, and we've got Q&A after the program. We'll have Lillian Sherman here at the Westin with the roving microphone, and then we've got Ken Grant monitoring the Zoom for questions there. So we look forward to that, and here to introduce our speaker is our very own Janelle Johnson. Welcome.
Thank you, past President Sue. Well, it is my honor to introduce Seattle University's 22nd president, which is President Eduardo Penalver. Also, I'm not sure how many of you know, he is the first non-Jesuit president of Seattle University. So I think that's pretty interesting. Prior to being named president, Eduardo served as Dean of Cornell University's Law School from 2014 to 2021. He's a Rhodes Scholar and Professor of Law who clerked for former U.S. Supreme Court Justice John Paul Stevens. Eduardo received his Bachelor's of bachelor's from Cornell College of Arts and Sciences in 1994 and his law degree from Yale Law School in 1999. As a Rhodes Scholar, he received his Master's of Arts in Philosophy and Theology at Oriel College in Oxford. In addition to Cornell Law School, Eduardo held faculty appointments at Fordham Law School and the University of Chicago, where he was the John P. Wilson Professor of Law. He has also been a visiting professor at Harvard and Yale Law Schools. His work on property law has been published in scholarly law journals at Yale University, the University of Michigan, Cornell, and University of Pennsylvania. He is considered the leading voice of progressive property movement, deriving many of his insights from Catholic social teachings. His research explores how property law creates reinforced communal bonds and how property rights, including relationship between individuals and communities. His first book was on property outlaws, and it was co-authored by Sonia Kenyal, and it was published by Yale University Press in 2011. It explores the vital role of it explores the vital role of disobedience within the evolution of property law. His second book, An Introduction to Property Theory, was co-authored with Gregory Alexander and was published by Cambridge University Press in 2011. I'm not sure many of you know, but President Eduardo was raised here in the Pacific Northwest in Puyallup, Washington. He met his wife, Sidal Kalantri, who is Associate Professor of Law at Seattle University School of Law. They met at Cornell as undergraduates, and they have two lovely young sons that I believe go to Lakeside. So please join me in giving a warm Seattle 4 Rotary welcome to President Eduardo Penalver.
Thank you, Janelle. That was a very generous introduction. Thank you all for inviting me to be here with you this afternoon. It's wonderful to be in person, and also want to thank the people who are participating by Zoom. As a university administrator for the past year as a president, and then before that as a law school dean, I would say that the most frequent thing I'm asked is about the state of freedom of expression on campus, and so I thought that's what I would talk about. And I look forward to your questions. I'll just start by pointing out that I think a lot of this debate and a lot of the sort of anxiety that surrounds it is sort of rooted in discourse that is undertaken in bad faith. And not to say that there aren't concerns and real challenges, and I'll get to those in a moment, but some of the concern over the state of speech on campus is really the product of a fairly concerted campaign in certain corners of the media, motivated by a hostility towards higher education, which is perceived as too liberal. And that hostility long predates the current conversations about campus speech, and really extend kind of throughout the history of universities, which have always been kind of seen as hotbeds of dissent. And I think we can see evidence of this in the fact that some of the contemporary critics of higher education are some of the people who until just recently were complaining about the lack of free speech on campuses have sort of pivoted to taking affirmative efforts to stifle
progressive campus voices, often using the coercive power of the state to accomplish that. So some of those who as recently as 3 years ago were complaining about the lack of freedom of speech on our campuses are now promoting sweeping and often fairly vaguely worded bans on so-called critical race theory on public university campuses. So just to give one example, in 2019, the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, criticized higher education institutions for failing to protect freedom of speech on campus, and he said, and I'll quote, "It's imperative for the future of our society that our state colleges and universities protect a culture of free speech on their campuses." And I agree. He urged Florida universities to sign a pledge to protect freedom of expression, and they did. But then this past year, Governor DeSantis signed what he calls the Stop Woke Act, which among other things prohibits private employers with more than 15 employees from advocating certain perspectives on questions of racial justice in employee training sessions. And a federal judge recently enjoined the enforcement of that law as he called it a fairly flagrant violation of private employers' First Amendment rights. And that law also applies to any mandatory activities in public K through 20 education in the state of Florida. The Florida law's provisions ostensibly targeted at so-called critical race theory, and I put that in scare quotes just because the definition of that in the act is so broad that it might be read to prohibit, for example, a university official endorsing the idea of affirmative action or asserting that black people experience any kind of systematic disadvantage in American life. Now, Florida is hardly alone in this effort. In a recent study by the pro-free speech organization PEN America found that 36 states have introduced legislation aiming to prohibit the teaching of critical race theory, with nearly 40% of those bills targeting higher education along with K through 12. And every one of those pieces of legislation was introduced by people who recently were criticizing universities for failing to protect free speech. Now, critical race theory is not the only issue where the expression of progressive ideas on campus is being stifled. Idaho's anti-abortion laws are so broad in their reach that the University of Idaho recently issued guidance to its faculty that they must remain studiously neutral and particularly not endorse abortion rights in their discussions of that issue with students, and that the state might consider any affirmative support of abortion rights by faculty in the classroom or in one-on-one conversations with students to constitute a felony. Now, you might be tempted to argue, and I think there would be a discussion to be had here, right, that it's correct that faculty should try to remain neutral in the classroom and talking about controversial issues, right? But I think it's important to recognize that the same law that might turn that into a felony would not prohibit the faculty member from advocating in the classroom or in one-on-one conversations with students the perspective that abortion is wrong and should be prohibited under all circumstances, right? So it's not consistent with the free expression of ideas. And so I just want to, so kind of stepping back from that, let me just be really clear at the outset that multiple things can be true at the same time, right? It can be true on campus that there are a dearth of conservative voices, and there are on campuses, right? Samuel Abrams, a political scientist at Sarah Lawrence, found that among college professors, liberals outnumber conservatives by about 6 to 1. And at colleges in the Northeast, the ratio is 28 to 1. It's also true that in certain occasions, universities have failed to adequately protect the academic freedom or freedom of expression of students and faculty who've expressed controversial views, and disproportionately those who have expressed controversial conservative views. And part of that is because progressive views on campus are not particularly controversial, right, because of that imbalance. So that can be true as well, right? And yet some, and I'm not saying all, but some of the loudest voices who have been sort of relentlessly attacking higher education for its failures are doing so in bad faith. And they're not really interested in promoting academic freedom or freedom of speech or viewpoint diversity, not trying to make higher education better, but they're just interested in kind of tearing down public confidence in higher education. Rather than point scoring, I think what we actually need is a really good faith conversation about how we can teach our young people about the value of free inquiry and open civil disagreement. Free inquiry and civil disagreement are really essential elements of the future of our democracy, and I think they're central to the university's mission of fearlessly searching for the truth and preparing the leaders of tomorrow. And these are important lessons that we need to be teaching our students. And teaching them requires that we expose our students, and I would say, and ourselves as educators and researchers and administrators, to a wide range of ideas, including ideas that we might consider to be wrong or mistaken or even offensive. In a society where robust but civil engagement across disagreement is the rare exception, the university needs to be a place where that happens. It needs to be countercultural in that regard. And I think these days, off campus, to a certain extent on campus, we tend to experience disagreement only episodically and in a very impoverished way. Emotionally manipulative algorithms stage manage our online experiences to ensure that the forms of disagreement that we encounter are usually anything but thoughtful. They're aimed at promoting virality, and so they're algorithmically designed to intentionally make us angry or perhaps feel morally superior, but not to encourage us to reflect or help us discern. Our lack of experience with truly thoughtful and thought-provoking disagreement has led to a collective atrophy of the virtues essential to civil discourse. And we can think about those virtues from the perspective of the listener and the speaker. So on the one hand, if we're to have productive engagement, we need to be willing to speak even when what we have to say can give offense, right? Even to people we usually find ourselves in agreement with. And that doesn't mean we should aim to give offense, right? But it can often happen. We need to have the courage to speak. But we need to speak in ways that affirm the dignity and the value of those people we disagree with, without sugarcoating our disagreement. And then on the other hand, we can't really make progress in our search for the truth unless we're willing to listen and engage even to people with whom we disagree. And again, even when they express views that we find unsettling or perhaps offensive. And fostering these virtues is an area where universities have frequently recently fallen short, more often than not because they fear controversy or bad publicity. I think more that than an affirmative desire to promote or suppress a particular point of view. And I say that having kind of lived through those controversies with other administrators and hearing them speak, they often will express a really strong desire to promote different points of view, even while they're struggling with the negative publicity, the tweet storm that something is generating. I'm very proud that last year, when a conservative student group at Seattle University's law school invited a speaker from an anti-LGBTQ rights group, the Alliance Defending Freedom, to come speak on campus, the talk went forward without any disruption. And you don't read that story in the press when it happens like that, right? You only read about it when it's disrupted. We received a small number of requests from law school community to cancel the speech. The law school's dean properly rejected those requests, explaining that we don't cancel student-sponsored speakers because of the point of view the speaker expresses. And rather than disrupting the speech, the law students did exactly the right thing. They set up a table and engaged in their own counter speech, or chose not to attend the talk. Our goal at Seattle University is not to avoid disagreement, but to become and teach our students to become better at disagreeing. That's part of our educational mission, and that's no small task, given the state of civil discourse that our students bring with them from society at large. Disagreeing well is a challenge. It's an area where I find myself frequently falling short, and so this is something I'm also trying to work on and learn to do better. And in fact, I think it's a skill that all of us on and off campus can afford to spend some time trying to improve. One question that often comes up in connection with discussions of campus speech is whether universities themselves ought to express any substantive values, right? Whether universities should just strive to serve as a kind of neutral platforms for the free expression of students and faculty. And this question is a particularly important one for a mission-driven university like Seattle University. Our vision statement commits us to being a university that is innovative, progressive, and Jesuit and Catholic, which is a challenging list of aspirations, concepts that are in considerable tension with one another, right? Not self-defining by any means. And some would consider that to be a challenge on its own, but they also would just consider the articulation of a vision statement like that to be a serious mistake for a university. One influential view is that a university should never express substantive values beyond those strictly necessary to support the core activities of research and teaching. Anything more, the argument goes, necessarily infringes on the freedom of students and faculty. The quintessential expression of this position was articulated by the Calvin Committee at the University of Chicago, where I taught for a couple of years before moving back to Cornell to become the dean in 2014. That committee's report, which you'll sometimes hear cited in press accounts of academic freedom dates back to 1967 at the height of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement. The president of the University of Chicago convened this committee, led by the legendary legal scholar Harry Calvin, to ask the question of what the university's relationship ought to be to the pressing political issues of the day. And the answer that the committee gave was not much, right? The university, the committee reasoned, is a community only for the limited and distinctive purposes of supporting teaching and research. As such, it's a community that cannot take collective action on the issues of the day without endangering the conditions for its existence and effectiveness. As the Calvin Committee put it, and I'll quote again, "There is no mechanism by which the university can reach a collective position without inhibiting that full freedom of dissent on which it thrives. It cannot insist that all of its members favor a given view of social policy, and if it takes collective action, it does so at the price of censuring any minority who do not agree with that view adopted." Now, while I agree with the committee that a university should not insist that all of its members take a particular view of any social policy, I find the rest of the committee's statement to be a bit of a non sequitur. It doesn't follow, logically or otherwise, if a university takes collective action or embraces a particular position on some issue, that it does so at the price of censuring any minority who does not agree with the view adopted. Right? The key to avoiding the danger identified by the committee is to vigorously affirm and protect the space for dissent and academic freedom on campus, even while being clear about what the university's substantive commitments are. The Calvin Report argues that you can't do these two things at the same time, right? Now, if that were the case, Seattle University's vision statement would be a serious mistake, right? Because it commits us to a set of values. In fact, I would go farther. If that were the case, the very possibility of Catholic higher education would be called into question. So we'd have to shut down Notre Dame and Georgetown along with Seattle University. Seattle University calls itself a Catholic university. And the truth of the Catholic faith, right, I don't need to tell you, is hardly uncontroversial. I assume most Catholics, non-Catholics, do not accept it. But calling ourselves Catholic doesn't prevent Seattle University from welcoming non-Catholics onto campus. In fact, only a quarter of our students, and probably a similar number of our faculty, self-identify as Catholic. And we welcome reasoned civil debate among our community members, even about Catholic teachings and even about what it means to be Catholic. Now, I think the Calvin Committee report suggests that's an impossibility, that we can't do both of those things at the same time. But like the Catholic priest who's asked whether he believed in infant baptism, I believe we can call ourselves Catholic and still protect academic freedom and freedom of the critics of the Catholic Church and its teachings on campus, because I've seen it done. And so I think the Calvin report's pessimism is unfounded. So I'll just give you one example to show why. Seattle University's decision to become carbon neutral and to divest from fossil fuels. This is something that the university committed to doing about 3 years ago. The University of Washington recently indicated that it plans to divest from fossil fuels as well. The Calvin Committee's position would seem to rule something like this out, right? Because that's a collective action on a contentious issue. Climate change is a contentious issue. It's uncontroversial in certain circles, probably in the city of Seattle, particularly at our universities, but it's deeply controversial if we consider the American polity as a whole. And yet to be among the first universities to achieve carbon neutrality or to divest ourselves from fossil fuels is an expression of our deepest values as an innovative and progressive and Jesuit and Catholic institution. Now, does that decision inhibit the academic freedom of members of our community, our faculty and student body who might disagree about climate change or about the wisdom of fossil fuel divestment? I don't think it does, as long as we simultaneously and vigorously insist on the freedom of community members to disagree. That freedom of dissent is not squelched by virtue of knowing that one's views don't align with those of the institution's administration. And if you doubt that, then you've never been to a faculty meeting. Now, there may be social pressure to go along with the views that enjoy consensus support among our faculty or among the student body or in the city of Seattle. But that kind of informal peer pressure exists whether or not Seattle University decides to take or not to take some collective action on a particular issue. I don't think we should be indifferent to that peer pressure, and my own view is that we should take steps to make clear that we respect freedom of dissent on campus and to mitigate the impact of peer pressure by fostering a culture that welcomes the expression of a diverse set of points of view on our campus. And I don't think that a university's decision to take some action on climate change or on some other issue exacerbates the situation one way or another. This leads to a related question. Would Seattle University, as a university committed institutionally to a particular position, say on climate change, be wrong to protect the academic freedom? Am I out of time? All right. Would we be wrong to protect the academic freedom of a community member who engaged in publication or speech about climate change, for example, from a contrary perspective? Would that mean that we're in fact not committed to combating climate change because we tolerate that perspective on our campus? And I hear versions of this argument a lot. If it were the case, I think then we should just hang it up, right? But if we were an advocacy organization, I think that would be true, right? Like an environmental group that fostered the speech of climate skeptics would be a pretty poor environmental advocacy group. But we're a university, and so we serve our mission in a distinctive way, right? Our way of living out our values takes a form appropriate to being a place for inquiry and research, for teaching and learning, and debate. And so essentially these activities are the freedom of our community members to dissent and the maintenance of ample space for reasonable disagreement and the presentation of different points of view. That's how universities should always operate. Of course, there might be views on climate change that are so far outside the mainstream that they call into question the professional competence of the person expressing them, right? A climate scientist who denies that carbon dioxide tends to warm the atmosphere, may not be entitled to academic freedom because they may have revealed themselves to be an incompetent climate scientist. But I would observe that argument wouldn't apply to the English professor who weighs in on climate change, or on the climate scientist who weighs in on criminal justice reform or critical race theory. But even on issues that touch on one's professional competence, I think we need to proceed with great caution and with the thumb firmly on the scale in favor of academic freedom, including the freedom to dissent from prevailing academic orthodoxies. And we don't need to go back as far as Galileo to find people who were dissenting from the prevailing point of view, the dominant point of view, who were ultimately proved correct. So to close, I don't agree with the Calvin Committee when it concludes that universities should not express values beyond those necessary to promote rigorous research. At Seattle University, our distinctive values as an innovative and progressive and Jesuit Catholic university are what sets us apart, right? And our expression of them makes us different and gives our students a choice in the world of higher education that they wouldn't otherwise have in this region, in the country. But we should look to express our values while continuing to be a place where rigorous research as well as teaching and learning can thrive. And this means being a place where a diversity of perspectives, where disagreement and dissent is welcomed, even about those values themselves. We shouldn't stifle voices on campus because they're insufficiently progressive, any more than we should stifle voices on campus because they're insufficiently Catholic. We express our values as a university by how we act, by our policies and practices, and our fossil fuel divestment is a good example of this. And we don't undermine those values by tolerating dissenting points of view. I think we can do this while continuing to affirm our fundamental commitment as a university to the robust exchange of ideas and a very broad conception of academic freedom. And I look forward to your questions on that or on anything else you want to ask me about.
Thank you. I have the microphone. Ken is giving me all kinds of quick things, so I will say first, my question, as a mother of a newly minted Red Hawk, he has been on campus for 3 weeks now.
Great.
My question is about student engagement in this conversation. He is coming from a very cynical place.
Yeah.
Where speaking your opinion is just a personal attack, coupled with the fact that they've been living in, a couple years of screen time.
Yeah.
How does the university even start to talk about how do we get these young people who have strong opinions but are used to getting slaughtered for expressing them back to the table?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's just, this is the challenge, right? I mean, because we are operating within this larger cultural context and fighting against, to the extent that we're aiming to live this out, we are fighting against the tide that our students bring to us. I think there are a couple ways we can do that. I mean, one is by living it out, by modeling it ourselves, right? And so one thing I did at my prior institution was started a series where we brought people from different points of view who I knew liked each other personally, and we'd put them up on a stage, and they'd disagree with each other, and they'd do it with smiles on their faces, and they'd have this great debate, and it was, and the conservative students would look at the conservative person in that couple, and they could identify with them, and the progressive students would look at the progressive person in that couple and identify with them. But then they saw these people liking each other and disagreeing really, firmly, substantively about stuff that matters, right? But doing it in really professional and cordial, even friendly ways. And I think that models the behavior we're trying to show them, and it can encourage them to give it a try in their own lives. The other way we can do it is by facilitating the students' own expression of their perspectives in really structured environments, where how we respond, in the classroom, how we respond as a teacher can show the rest of the class that, what that person just said, you can kind of coax out the strongest version of that argument from the student. And it's not necessarily one you would advocate as a faculty member, but you can show the other students that this controversial point of view is within the realm of kind of acceptable discourse.
Thank you. Do I have one more?
Okay, we got one more question, sorry.
Hi, I'm sure you know that Father Sundberg was a longtime member of Seattle Rotary.
Yes.
Is there wisdom from Father Sundberg that you like to carry forward?
Yes, I mean, so much. Father Steve was president for 24 years, he said, and I got to know him during this transition, which was announced a long time ago. So I was just looking at a photo that popped up on my phone that said 2 years ago I was flying back from my interview, and that was the first time I met Father Steve. One of the things the Jesuits are known for is discernment, and the very deep practice of discernment. And it's not an area where, my prime kind of way of being as an administrator is very action-oriented, and I like to sort of move forward and do stuff. And one of the pieces of wisdom Father Steve gave me during our long conversations during the transition was to occasionally slow down and try to listen and discern and not just act. And so that kind of patience and reflection and discernment is something that I work on every day as a university president, and Father Steve was excellent at it. And so I have definitely big shoes to fill and a tough act to follow. Great, thank you.
Thank you, Eduardo, for your leadership and for braving these discussions with our young leaders to come. I know it's helped me know better how to handle Ken Grant, because, kidding, I couldn't help that. In recognition of your generosity of time, Seattle 4 has contributed to Harvest Against Hunger, which provides healthy meal components to food banks. 600 servings of produce have been given in your name. Thank you for being here. I've got Lillian and Ken, thank you for monitoring questions. We also would like to express our thanks to several of our sponsors, our gold sponsors Liz Powell with Remax on the market, and longtime Rotary supporter Bob Alexander. Additional sponsors include Joel Farrow with Morgan Stanley, Dominic Masafia, Seattle Divorce Options, Jacobson Jarvis, Certified Public Accountants, Matt Bratlian, NetTech Pro Bono IT Services, and for our tech support today live, Oak AV. Now to share programs, and I don't disagree with him, our Prince of Programs, Ken Grant. Welcome.
All right. Do we have slides? Get rid of that ugly dude. Not this one, the one before it. Next week is so cool because it's all about the satellite industry. We've never had anybody talk about the satellite industry here before, so I got that one check through the box. The week after that, we've got the city attorney that, as of yesterday, will now be a monitored conversation with Mark Wright. So I'm super excited about that. And then to pick up sort of a little bit about what you were talking about today, Eduardo, and then last week, Anita Dalmia, the week after that on Zoom, is talking about the work that she does in universities with kids around fake news. What's fake, what's not, and how do you get through all the chatter? And then a couple of things, just to throw it in, we've got 7 or 8 tickets left to the whale watching, so get on that. International tour is happening with Ucenta. Is gone. She's probably already there, ready to go. She's ready just early. And then our good friend Ezra is in the room today, and this is also with Mark, on Polio Day, October the 20th. Mark your calendar because you can do this in person or on the Zoom. 4 till 8. There's an email going out tomorrow around this, so we're very excited. So please, before I leave the stage, Eduardo, thank you. John, thank you. Kelsey, thank you. And please give it up because this is my one and only time that I'm ever going to work with my good friend, Sue Nixon.
Ken Grant, you are a legend. Well, Ezra, welcome. Thank you for being here today. Thank you all for being here today. I have to admit, I was most nervous about the fact that our sports commissioner leader closes with a sports theme, right? And I got kicked off of my junior high basketball team for running the wrong direction at a very critical time in the game. So with that, I did talk with Beth and say, please script this for me. So here it goes. I'm going to try to make you proud, Beth. No one who is watching our local sports team will need convincing of the power of Seattle sports. Wazoo won a big game at home and the Huskies rallied but ran out of time losing at UCLA. The Seahawks won an exciting shout-out over the Detroit Lions to even their record at 2-2. Finishing with most successful season of all, Seattle teams, the OL Reign, clinched the playoffs and will host a semifinal game on October 23rd. Then, the Mariners broke a 21-year playoff appearance drought and are hosting sellout crowds of 45,000 fans per game. Last night, Climate Pledge Arena hosted what we hope is the first of many NBA games with a preseason exhibition between the LA Clippers and the Portland Trail Blazers. There were over 18,000 fans and countless more wishing they could crash that sold-out showcase facility. The pride our region has for its sports teams is leading a welcome, back to normal spirit in Seattle, and it's spreading across the state. As Ken Griffey Jr. says, when you have fun, it turns all the pressure into pleasure. I think Bill Center would agree that's a pretty good rule. Thank you, and we'll see you next week.